Hi, my name is Mianmian, and I'm a PhD candidate in higher education and student affairs at The Ohio State University in the United States. Today, I'm going to talk about two peer-reviewed journal articles that I published in the past year, both on racial learning of international students in the US. The first article I'm going to talk about is my scholarly paper published on the winter 2024 special issue of the Journal of Comparative and International Higher Education. This paper re-examines the 2014 framework with more recent literature on how international students learn about race in the US. Building on the findings from this first article, my second article presents practice implications for supporting international students' racial learning. It was published as a practice brief in early 2025 on the Critical Internationalization Studies Review. First, to give you some background of this research, nearly 90% of international students in the US are non-white individuals who fall into the people of color category in the US context. While there is growing literature on these students' experiences with racism and racial discrimination, relatively less research focuses on how they learn about race in this country. Indeed, the US bears a rather unique racial history shaped by European colonization, African enslavement, and successive waves of immigration. This history has resulted in a rather oppressive racial hierarchy whose legacy today is still deeply entrenched in all aspects of American life. The US race logic, as well as the centrality of race in this country, are likely to be unfamiliar, if not confusing, to many international students. Although several racial identity development models exist, they primarily consider native-born individuals' race under this US race logic. In contrast, international students bring their understandings of race and ethnicity from their home countries, and therefore likely to find the US logic incongruent with their own. As race is not understood and experienced uniformly across nations, there is a pressing need to transnationalize the serialization of race and racial identity development. Professor Fry Britt and her colleagues pioneered this endeavor in the higher education field and came up with an emerging framework in 2014, capturing how international students of color perceive race and respond to racialized experiences in the US. This learning race in a US context framework was derived from data collected from 15 undergraduate and graduate physics students from Black majority countries. Today, the framework has been cited over 200 times across disciplines. As you can see on this slide, the authors divided international students' learning of race in the US context into three categories and proposed that students move from one category to the next through racial encounters, or REs, in the US, though not necessarily in a linear fashion. While the US context circle signifies the context of racial learning, it intersects with the home country context circle. This demonstrates that students begin their racial learning in the US with preconceived racial understandings from their home countries. Let me quickly walk you through these three categories. First, students' preconceived racial understandings, on the one hand, can distance them from their US-born minority peers, whose racial struggles make little sense to them. On the other hand, they may also act as a buffer, allowing students to avoid examining their racial ethnic identities in the US context or addressing any racial encounters. Even when they face with severe racism, students may first turn to their home country context for understanding, dismissing these incidents as distractions from their academic pursuits. As the frequency and severity of racial encounters increase over time, some students move to the second category and start paying greater attention to race, particularly how their minority status are situated within the US racial context. Race then becomes a motivation for academic success. However, only one participant in the original studies reached the third category of integrative awareness, in which they understood their racial ethnic identities in the US context with confidence and were committed to ending racial injustice. In the decade after the publications of the framework, international students have become an increasingly prominent population on US college campus. At the same time, the US public has viewed racial climate in the country as worsening. The question is whether the framework, which was developed based on data collected from international students of a single race pursuing a single major over 10 years ago, still effectively captures the racial learning experiences of the diverse international student population today. To answer this question, I conducted a systematic literature review over empirical studies published in the past decades that explore international students' racial learning. To identify these studies, I conducted a search in Google Scholars and ERIC using specific keywords and inclusion criteria as shown on the slide. I then supplemented this with relevant studies that cited the framework. This process led to the identification of 11 relevant studies as shown in the table. All of them are qualitative in nature, drawing from micro-level narratives of international students from diverse countries of origin in different fields of studies. So, what does the literature tell us? Literature generally confirms that international students initially hold unexamined racial ethnic identities in the US context, since they can tend to their home country context for understanding, many are inclined to ignore examining their racial ethnic identities in the US context. This is particularly true in populations that did not have the opportunity to move physically to the US during the pandemic. While Professor Fry-Britt and her colleagues pretty much equipped racial encounters in the framework to racist encounters in moving students from one category to the next, the literature expands the notion of racial encounters to include various means of acquiring racial knowledge, such as through media, personal relationships, and coursework. More recent articles also expand racial encounters to the public sphere, referring to public events such as anti-racist and civil justice movement. Well, the framework suggests that students initially refrain from responding to racist incidents because they could turn to their home country context for understanding. The literature shows that the reasoning behind the lack of response is more complex. For example, for racial encounters in the public sphere, students' lack of participation can be attributed to their fragile immigration status. On the other hand, research on East Asian international students specifically finds that participants accepted racist encounters as they were, not because they turned to their home country's racial context, but because they accepted the US informed global hierarchy of race as a social fact, even before some of them had stepped foot in the US due to the pandemic. In addition, while some students saw racist incidents as distractions, others turned to self-criticism, attributing racist incidents to their insufficient English skills, introverted personalities, or lack of knowledge to identify microaggressions. Literature also demonstrates the importance of experiential racial encounters in moving students from Category 1 to Category 2. These experiential racial encounters include engaging with different students on campus and building meaningful connections with US peers. It is worth noting that while the framework suggests that students reaching Category 2 would use future racial encounters as motivation for academic success, this theme is not explicitly featured in the articles I reviewed. As you can see in the framework, the home country context intersects with the US context but does not directly connect to any of the categories, indicating that the framework considers the home country context as a background influence of students' racial learning. However, existing literature suggests that students' home country context can exert a much more significant impact on their racial learning in the US, to the extent that racial ideologies from home countries can be employed to racialize other minorities on campus. The last categories of the framework mirrors the outcome of traditional racial identity development models for US minority students, in which students see race as a motivation to succeed and influence others in their minority groups. However, only one participant in the original study reached this category. The authors also claimed that international students of color were, in fact, unlikely to achieve this outcome due to their different experiences with race in their home countries. Only a few participants in one study that I reviewed mentioned the achievement of integrative awareness. The rest of the reviewed literature, on the other hand, suggests a few possible alternative outcomes. One is that students may keep embracing racial identities in the US context as either a decolonial resistance or a result of their post-graduation plans back to their home countries. Another possibility is that the minoritized experience in the US could evoke students' self-reflexivity and intercultural empathy towards marginalized groups in both their home countries and in the US. Such a hopeful possibility could open the potential for creative coalitions in social justice works. In short, the review of recent literature shows that the learning raised in the US context emergent framework is still generally applicable to understanding international students' racial learning in the US. It effectively illustrates how many students lack knowledge of race in the US context and how racial encounters can shift them to racial ethnic identity examination. However, the recent literature also reveals that the framework may overlook the multiplicity of what racial encounters could imply and the complexities of students' reasoning and reactions when racial encounters take place. Therefore, I suggest that the framework can benefit from incorporating the following revisions. The first is to broaden the scope of racial encounters from racist encounters to various means of racial knowledge acquisition in the personal and public sphere. The second is to give equal attention to students' home country context rather than treating it as a mere background influence. I therefore propose a revised framework from a transnational lens, which can elucidate how the home country context and the spread of whiteness ideology influence students' racial learning in the US. The third is to leave the ultimate outcome of racial learning open, recognizing that international students may achieve very different outcomes based on their prior experiences and future plan. My scholarly article thus closes with a piece of reflection on how international students who do not take the US race logic for granted and bring fresh perspectives with them could potentially inform the learning and relearning of race among domestic students, especially amidst the troubling racial tension in the US today. I will now briefly talk through my second publication, which draws on the articles reviewed in the first publication, along with additional literature to systematically discuss practice-oriented recommendations for supporting international students' racial learning in the US in terms of higher education administration, curricula, and student affairs programming. First, instead of aggregating international student data solely based on geographic origins, U.S. Higher education institutions should acknowledge international students' racial and ethnic identities along with their national identities. Doing so would be an important first step towards recognizing their racialized experiences on campus and thus incorporating them into the discussion of racial diversity and multicultural policies. In addition, coursework on American histories, particularly its racial foundations, is another widely recommended practice in existing literature. While ethnic study courses available in most universities address race-related content, their focus on US-based racial ethnic groups may limit their relevance for international students from different cultural and historical backgrounds. Existing literature, therefore, recommends joint coursework between ethnic studies and international studies department or creative alternatives like full-credit intergroup dialogues to make discussions on race in the US context relevant and applicable for international students. The most common practice recommendation in the literature is to formalize international students' racial learning through student affairs programming. These programs can include initiatives to foster meaningful connections between international students and racially diverse domestic students, faculties, and staff, facilitate a space where international students can ask questions and engage in discussions without fears of reprisal, and targeted orientation for international students which openly address racial issues in the US. Successful development and implementations of such programs would require collaborations between offices responsible for international students and those overseeing multicultural affairs, as it would allow students' affairs professionals to address the intersection of nativity and race in supporting international students' racial learning. Finally, it is very important to stress that the burden of racial learning should not rest solely on international students alone. To echo the final reflections note from my first piece, it is important to also cultivate an appreciation of cultural diversity and encourage thinking beyond US-centric cultural norms among domestic students. Faculties and staff should also have access to learning opportunities that foster global awareness and sensitivity, particularly an understanding of how race is perceived differently outside of the US, so that they can better support international students as they navigate racial learning in a new context. So this is a brief summary of my two publications on the racial learning of international students in the US. I encourage you to check out the two articles if you are interested in learning more. So thank you very much for the attention, and I wish you a great day. Bye.